So, we're going to do Ruth for the next 4 weeks, so if you want something to read the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters, you can read it in one sitting. I want to start, how many of you have read Ruth, by the way? Or at least are familiar with the contents of it? Okay. So, yeah, it will help you to have read the whole thing this week or be familiar with the story, but you don't need to, because we're going to read the whole thing chapter by chapter. First of all, just to put it in its historical context, for those of you who like to do this stuff, this is the entire history of the Bible from creation to Jesus. And these are all famous people, right? Abraham, Isaac, Joseph. They're in Egypt. Then you got Moses, leads them out of Egypt. There's a time of judges before the kings. And so Ruth is somewhere in here. At the beginning of Ruth, it says when judges ruled. So when the judges were ruling, it was kind of a haywire time. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes, the Bible says. And God would punish people with bad things, and then the judges would come and rescue them, and then they'd be good for a while, and then they'd turn away. And so they went through this cycle for a while. And Ruth happens during that cycle. Bethlehem, that's where she lived. Who recognized the town of Bethlehem? What happened in Bethlehem? Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's right. And so that's part of what we're going to find out is important. And may, in fact, be Jesus' birth and Jesus' lineage may, in fact, be the main reason that this story's in the Bible. Because the first thing we're going to try and figure out is why the book of Ruth is in the Bible in the first place. What's it here for? Is it here as a teaching thing, or is it here just to explain why? And I think this is the primary reason Ruth is in the Bible. I think it's in there to explain to people why David has a Moabite great-grandmother. Because there's the whole lineage, right? And you're like, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. Wait a minute. Why is there a Moabite in David's lineage? And well, that one requires explaining. And so that, I think, is probably actually the biggest reason that Ruth is in the Bible, is just to explain David's lineage and how this foreigner got in there. And we're going to see that turns out to be, it's not a small thing that there is a Moabite in David's lineage. So that's what we're going to look for as we go through here. And I will tell you this also, I think, in my opinion, a lot of people read a lot more into this story than there is in it. They read it like it's a parable. Like the whole thing is constructed on a piece of paper by somebody who's trying to map out a plot. And it's important as we go through this to remember that this is a real person. This really happened to real people, and it's the way their life went. And so we certainly can learn lessons from them, but it's not the same as reading a story where you know the author has written something, has crafted every sentence to mean something. Like parables, when Jesus told them, we pick those apart because that's what they are. But this is a historical happening that we can learn from. To start with, the names of the people in here do actually mean something, and I think there's a little bit of irony in here. So it starts out, what's the story start out with? A famine, right? There's a famine in the city called House of Bread. So that's pretty interesting. I don't know why. Some people just like this stuff. I do. So the guy's name, the father, the patriarch's name is Elimelech, which means God is my king. God is my king. And so as soon as there's some difficulty in House of Bread, God is my king decides what? I'm out of here, right? So he doesn't really live up to his name, does he? God is my king as long as things are easy. And as soon as things are hard, I'm not going to be Elimelech anymore. So, and Naomi means pleasant, and then you heard her say, don't call me Naomi anymore when she came back 10 years later. Call me bitter, call me Mara, because of what has happened to me. So, we're going to look at the story, we're going to look at it as a story we can learn from, but not a parable. Not a parable that we're going to try and pick apart in the way that parables often get picked apart. And so one of the things about looking at the story this way, is that we want to kind of there's a sermon outline and stuff in there. You don't have to get it out because there's no blanks to fill out. But if you look at it, it's going to say things like, there's something in here about. And it's going to give you some different things. There's something in here about. Because I think as we watch this story unfold, there are things we can think about, even if they're not like crafted into the story to teach us that exactly. And so the first thing we see, just to remember the plot, the family is in Bethlehem, and there's a famine. So Elimelech and Naomi and the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they go to Moab. Elimelech, the dad, dies there. And then Mahlon and Chilion both take Moabite wives while they're in Moab. And then the two sons die. And so it's just Naomi and her daughters-in-law. And she hears that the famine's over in Bethlehem. So they decide to go back. And Orpah, which by the way was Oprah's name originally, she changed it from Orpah to Oprah because she thought Oprah sounded better. She was named after that character. Orpah decides to go back to Moab, and then Ruth stays with Naomi. And that's kind of all we see in here. So the first thing that I think, the first place this story, because it's a real story about real people, can help us think real thoughts about our real lives, even though we're not going to encounter the same situation. I think there's something in here to think about escapism. Because they had trouble in their town, and they decided to leave. There was a famine, and they decided to leave town. And what we're going to see in a minute, there's this in Deuteronomy. It's actually in the law. It says this. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord." And so, why would they pick Moab of all places to go to? Well, first of all, it's not very far. You just go east, and it's across the river. And so there's this sense of running from the problems, because other people stayed, right? Most of the people stayed because they were all there when Naomi got back. But Elimelech and his family decided to run away from their problems, the problems of their family. And that's something for us to think about. And all the things we're going to think about today are areas of tension. They're kind of gray. They're like, there is a time to run. There is a time to flee. Anyone ever see The Great Race? Old movie? Did you? All right. Hey, a couple of people. Anyway, there's a couple of guys having a sword fight. And one guy stops and runs and turns around and he says, "He who fights and runs away may live to fight another day." And then he jumps out of the window. So there's a time to run, and there's a time not to run. And I think we have to be careful of escapism. And that's one of the things that we can reflect on as we look at this. They went to a land of another god. It wasn't just a different area. They didn't go north to another territory in Israel. They kind of disregarded their whole promised land boundaries. They disregarded their identity and their boundaries and went wherever it seemed most convenient or something like that. Yeah. Expedient. Expediency took the place of loyalty. They left their whole country. They could have gone north or something because the family wasn't going to be in the whole world. But they took the place of expediency to escape the trouble. And I think that that's one thing that we can think about. Where are you tempted toward escapism? Where are you tempted to take the expedient route? Because different people are tempted toward escapism in different ways. Sometimes it's like emotional escapism. And escaping is running from the true situation. And people can escape in two ways. There's the one that's more clearly an escape. And that escape is where the person withdraws, either physically or they just kind of shut down. They're kind of a turtle, they pull their head in, and they just don't want to face the situation. That's certainly an escape. but it's also an escape to blow up. It's another way of not sitting down and talking through things with somebody. So when there's emotional, relational situations, what kind of things tempt you to escape, and what way do you escape? Do you escape by fleeing, or do you escape the situation by attacking another person instead of trying to work it out? They're both escapes, and it's worth just thinking about those kind of how escapism gets in the way. In the case of this family, they tried to escape the famine by going to another land. And what happened? Elimelech died, and then Mahlon died, and Chilion died. They tried to run from death, and what did they find? Death. You can't run from your problems. They'll still be there. If you pull your head into your shell, and just... And I'm not saying there's not a moment to calm down or take a breather or all that stuff, but if, like, over the long term, your strategy is to escape by pulling away, or your strategy is to escape by overpowering, never facing the issue, either way, that problem is still there and you haven't actually got rid of it. All you've done is try to escape from it. And like happened with Naomi and Elimelech, the problem is still there and it follows you. They tried to get away from death, and death came to them anyways. And so that's one of the things that I think we could just sort of contemplate from this story. Again, I don't know that that's what the story is actually teaching or not, but it certainly happened, and we can think about it. Think about your movements. Are they based in faith or fear? The way you move emotionally when things get tense or heated or cold. Think about the movements in your life. Maybe your physical movements. When you're moving from a job or think about, there's just so many different ways in which we place ourselves and move in different ways. And what's behind your movements? Is it fear or is it faith? I think in Naomi's case it was fear, and the fear followed the very thing they feared and fled from followed them. And that's going to be the case with us too if we're fleeing things out of fear, if our movements are based in fear. So that's one thing to think about. The next thing I think that we can just sort of reflect on is faith. What does faith look like? What does faith look like for Naomi? Naomi puts God at the center of her life. Everything that happens comes from God. God caused a famine in the land. God dealt bitterly with her in Moab. Later on, we're going to find that God is, smiling on her in the end. In Naomi's faith, the Lord blesses. The Lord's hand is against her sometimes. And I think her attitude, there's one place that I think she's exemplary and one place that makes me question. The exemplary place is that she never curses God. Not once. She may believe that God has done things to her, but she never curses God. And I think that's exemplary. I think it's an example for all of us that she never calls God a bad name. Never says God is unjust. Never says anything negative about God. She certainly says God has dealt bitterly with me, but she never ever moves to that place where it wasn't God's prerogative because God is God. And so I think that's exemplary, but the flip side of it is a thing that causes tension for us. Causes tension, I think, in our lives. Tragedy befell Naomi's family when they left their ancestral home to go to Moab, right? So that's what happened. They left Bethlehem to go to Moab, and then Elimelech died, and Mahlon and Chilion died. So how did Naomi interpret that tragedy? It seems reasonable that she interpreted it as their own fault. Because they ran from their own land to Moab, the very place they weren't supposed to be, and one of the few peoples they really were supposed to stay separate from and not let into the assembly. So she interprets that as God dealing with her, right? She says, God has dealt bitterly with me. But that leaves us in a tension, because we have to, and I'm sorry for this, but I don't have an answer for you. I just have a tension for you and say, well, this is the tension of faith. What is God controlling? Now, some people say God controls everything, but if God can, and I bring this up probably too much, but if God controls everything, then God has let some pretty horrible things happen. I mean, do you believe? Okay, so I saw a sketch online of Hurricane Matthew kind of pushing away from the coast, and someone had drew the hand of God right there, pushing Matthew away from the coast. I'm okay with that. I want to praise God that Matthew didn't do anything worse. But my question is, how would you feel if Matthew had devastated the coast and someone had drawn the hand of God pushing Matthew toward the coast? Because you can't really do one without the other. Either God's guiding the hurricane or He's not, right? I mean, and so this story leaves us in that tension. And one of the things I think Naomi really does is she doesn't resolve the tension. She just says, this happened, and I know God is doing things. She doesn't actually, she sort of pins it on him, but not exactly. She doesn't say, God killed my family. She doesn't not say that. She just kind of lets it hang there. And I think that's where we have to go, because obviously horrible things happen. I remember Katrina. Who remembers Katrina? Anybody remember? Yeah, right. How could you not remember Katrina? So some people looked at, and Katrina had that crazy pattern, right? It went, woo, and then it went out, and then it turned around, and it came back, and it slammed New Orleans. Sin City, right? It's like New Orleans, like, what's the city down at the end of the, Key West. Thank you, Key West. You know where this is going. So Kelly and I were in a cab one time, and the cabbie, as soon as we got in the cab, the cabbie said, "Welcome to God's little Sin City. I can get you anything you want." Okay, here we are. What we'd like to do is go to a hotel. Thank you. But New Orleans is like that, right, too. It's like that. And so that hurricane turned around and slammed in New Orleans. People like, you know what? That was God. God got New Orleans because it's such a sinful city. Do you remember what part of New Orleans did not get flooded? The French Quarter. Right. So now, what? Yes. The training ground for Key West. So now, so see, you're left with this tension. All the natural stuff, you really just are left with tension. And anytime you try and resolve it, it's not going to work out. And so I think that's the second thing, is that we leave the tensions where they are. We're not willing to say God is out of control, but we're not willing to say God did that. At least I'm not, on a lot of things. And so I sort of live with Naomi. Well, God's in control. I'm not sure what's going on there. So I would ask you, what does your faith look like? I mean, how does your faith operate when real world things happen? Because that's what's important here, is that this whole story of Ruth is a real world story. It's like trying to, it's just like the hurricanes or anything else. It's something that actually happened. And if you want to try and interpret it through the lens of faith, what does it look like? Does your faith require you to say, God is steering that hurricane like a school bus? Is that what your faith requires you to say? And I don't have an answer for you. I told you, this one is not the one that I'm going to have an answer for you. Some people see God like a vending machine. If they prayed hard enough, I've heard people try to teach other people how to pray the right way so that God answers. That doesn't feel comfortable to me. That doesn't feel like my faith. Because if God is a father, and I'm a father, my son son doesn't have to like script his words just right to get me to pay attention. Hopefully, maybe he does sometimes, if I'm not really good at it. So is God like a vending machine for you? You've got to get it just right, and God will do what you want. Is God more like the judge, and you know, if bad things don't happen, then that's not God. But if something bad happens, that's God judging people. Is that kind of the way your faith operates? Or is God just like indifferent, and these things just happen? Or is it just the world doing what the world does, and people do what they do, and sometimes that interacts well, like the beach yesterday was everything beautiful? That's because the vacuum cleaner came through. So, you know, this leaves us with tension. We want to, I want more than anybody, just as much as anybody. I hear people like talking about, you know, God, and they say things that I want to be true, but we're always faced with reality too. But then we have reality that also has faith that's affecting in some way that we don't always know. So, I think Naomi helps us acknowledge the tensions of faith. There are tensions in our faith, and we're not going to resolve them. We're better off just to say, well, there are those tensions. But just because we don't understand everything doesn't mean that our faith is not real and true and right and good. It just means we don't understand everything, which we should all be very comfortable admitting. So, we can reflect on escapism. As we go through the book of Ruth, we can reflect on our faith and what our faith says about God guiding our lives and blessing or punishing or whatever. We can think through that a little bit because we're watching this happen to a real person in a real place. And the third thing that we can reflect on is grace. And that's really, I think, what we're going to find out is the end of the Naomi, of this whole story of Ruth, is it's going to turn out to be a story of grace. And in a little way, it's even, there's a way in which it is actually the story of Israel. So in the end, it's a tease, it's a spoiler, I'm sorry, but things are going to turn out very well for Ruth. She's going to get married and all this stuff, and it's going to turn out really well. And what we have is some people in Israel leaving Israel because there's a famine. Do you remember anyone else who left this land because there was a famine? Yes. Joseph's family. Remember the story of Joseph? Joseph, his brothers threw him in the pit, blah, 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 prime minister of Egypt. There's a great famine in the land, and Joseph's brothers leave Israel to go to Egypt, and there's that whole other story. And then Jacob's family all moves to Egypt, and they're there for a while, and then they go back to Israel. So here we have a famine, and this little family here moves away. Things get hard, just like things got hard for the Israelites. And part of that, it was in that difficulty that drove them to follow Moses to go back. And so this little family has this difficulty, and it drives them back to Bethlehem, where, and here I'm going to give away the big thunder, Ruth is redeemed. The Moabite is redeemed. And he's welcomed and becomes an ancestor of Judah. That's huge. It's almost like this story is the story of Israel, played out in a single decade. And it becomes our story too. Because we look at grace. Okay, so here's that law from Deuteronomy. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. I'm going to finish that up. Because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. And because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Bethor, to curse you. And so the Moabites were against the Israelites. Not just neutral, but actually against them. And so because of that, the law in Deuteronomy says, it says of all those other people that if they want to come and become Israelites, they can, except for these two groups. The Moabites are out and the Ammonites are out. They are just out. And yet, what happens? Ruth happens. Ruth happens. And so, even in this time, this very planned kind of time, Ruth will not leave Naomi. And so she comes back, and Ruth ends up, a Moabitess, ends up in the assembly of Israel. Remember what we just read? No Moabite will enter the assembly of the Lord. And Ruth ends up in the assembly of the Lord. What does this tell us? This tells us that the rules are not as important as the love. And it's true everywhere, in all times, and in all places. Grace trumps legalism. Grace trumps legalism, even in the Bible itself. So my question to you is, how's your grace in your life? How's your balance between having to keep the rules and yet being a person of grace and love, offering those fresh starts, offering redemption, offering peace to people after they have done things that are against whatever rules you have for the people around you? Kids and otherwise. We all have rules of good behavior that we expect the people around us to follow if they're going to be the people that we hang around. And my question to you is, does grace trump the rules that you have for other people? Does grace trump the rules you have for other people? Because here, grace trumps the rules. Here, it is Ruth's love that overcomes the rules and brings her into the assembly. Ruth the Moabitess, who shall not be welcomed into the assembly of Israel, becomes the great-grandfather of King David, a man after God's own heart. Arguably, one of the top 2 or 3 people in the entire Old Testament history. And his great-grandmother is a Moabite. Now that speaks to a lot of other things too, which we'll probably get to in the coming weeks. There's like racism in there, or lack of racism, and all sorts of things. But today, what I just really wanted to remember is the grace that Ruth is welcomed in because of her love for Naomi. And how is grace operating in your life? When your rules get broken, is your heart ready to be gracious? Is your heart ready to be forgiven? Because that's what we see here. And that's what we see in Jesus. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We are the Moabites. We are the ones on the outside that God has welcomed in to his assembly. And it is through grace. And it is the grace shown us in Jesus by his death and resurrection that we receive, we absorb, and then we reflect to the world. That's how we become the people of grace. We receive the grace, and then we reflect it to the world. We absorb it, and then we emit it. So that's where I'd like to leave this story today, to think about things that we want to think about to grow. So there's some points to ponder. I'm going to put these up here, and then we're going to play a short song, and then I'll give you a chance to think, maybe write, if you're the writing sort of person, or talk, or whatever. And this will be the time to bring your offerings up and your prayer cards and everything. And then after that, we'll celebrate the Lord's Supper. So during this song, think about these things. Talk about these things. Are movements you are contemplating based in faith or fear? Could be actual movements. Could be some sort of emotional way you want to be toward other people. Could be a relationship whether you're into or out of or away from a relationship with another person. It will be helpful to you to actually write down what tensions exist in your faith that you need to stare in the face. Because ignoring data is no Christian thing. Ignoring data is no Christian thing. What tensions, what realities do you need to stare in the face? Because that's going to make you, in the long run, it's going to strengthen your faith because it's going to be based more and more on truth. And number 3, where do you need to receive grace over law in your life? Is there some place that you're being legalistic with yourself where you need to be kind to yourself, or where you need to offer grace over law to other people. And so let's take a moment and pray, and then we'll take a short break and celebrate the Lord's Supper. Father in heaven, this book of Ruth, it's thank you for keeping it in your word, so that we can look at it, so we can study it, so we can think about it. Father, as we look in Ruth, help us to see where we are being escapist in some way. Whether it's the escapist of moving away from something, or whether it's the escapism of throwing up walls or attacking something that we don't want to face in a calm, gentle, and loving way, that we'd rather just overpower than work through. Show us where we're being escapists so that we can not be by the power of the Holy Spirit. Show us our faith, and let us learn maybe a little bit more today how faith is in fact trusting you in those areas of tension where understanding eludes us. Help us to embrace that wholeheartedly, that tensions that go with our faith. And then help us see this grace that comes on Ruth. The grace that trumps the law. And help us treat ourselves that way when we get down on ourselves over whatever rules we've broken, in all the different ways that rules come into our lives. And help us also be the kind of people that offer that grace to others that you have offered to us. We ask all that, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen.